Welcome to Friday night's video in our Master Series. This is the 81st video in our Master Series and the 12th video in our Mixing Concepts. This is probably the last video in our Mixing Concepts because I really wanted to address some of the most basic issues. But there's one other issue that I've found that really is something that can make and break your production. This is filling in the frequency field. Now, in the spectrum, this is a problem because a lot of times you might have something going on in some certain production that you don't want to fill in the spectrum, that you want it pretty dry. It's like it might only have an oboe and flute there, and that's great. That's what you want. You don't want to be trying to fill in the spectrum there and have it sound like a bong going on because you wanted that flute and that oboe working together and doing this thing, bro. You know, I don't want to do all that other stuff behind it. You know, that's an example of when not to, because you want them having that little moment of whatever's going on in your production. But there's a lot of times that I see in a lot of productions that people just fail to fill in the spectrum. It's like you've got instruments that are going to fill in certain frequency ranges in the spectrum while they're playing. Does that make sense? And sometimes that in certain sections or, you know, in certain movements or transitions that it's lacking fill. It's like you really need some bass there, or you need some mid-range, or you need some high-end, or you need some, you know, something going on there that's going to fill out the spectrum a little bit so that it sounds nice and full. So, you know, I always in my DAW and in my song start template, have some folders that are dedicated in the song file to fill. That way that if I'm going along and I'm listening to the production and it's like, you know, it needs some, you know, low end here or something, but in the production there is no low end. You know, the bass isn't covering that, and it really needs that to fill it in to make it sound nice and full. And that can go the same for the high end also. A lot of times in production it's the low and high end that are lacking. You know, and I'll go in there and fill it with synth. You know, I'll take synthesizers and actually take the synthesizer and try to follow the main melody or the main bass line or something like that with a synth that I bring up very lightly underneath the whole production to make it sound fuller, to make it sound fatter, thicker, and fuller. And this can happen. I get some things to be like a real basic band. Give you a prime example. The guy's got a guitarist, he's got a bass player, he's got a drummer and a vocalist. And it needs some fill. It sounds like it just not. I mean, it's a little bit, you know, and I'll go in there and fill it up underneath a lot of stuff. I'll bring stuff like that up underneath with synthesizers and either pad synths and things like that, or, you know, synths that are complementary to the sound. And most of the time, you won't ever even hear it. It's like you're never going to know there was a synth following the bass and the guitar at a sub octave or at a different octave that the guitar was playing to fill out the spectrum. You'll never even know it was there, but it sure sounds fuller. It sounds fatter, it sounds fuller, and it's filling out the spectrum. Sometimes you don't. Sometimes you got, you know, some kind of, you know, rock and roll song that, no, bro, if you start putting synths back there and all kinds of stuff, it just doesn't sound quite right. Does that make sense? But a lot of times you can get away with it, and it sounds so much better by filling out the spectrum. That means just adding to it. You've got, you know, the guitars playing in one section and basically in one octave area, and you start playing some pad synths following what he's doing for the most part, in an octave up and a couple octaves up or whatever, and down lower, and doing the same thing with the bass and things like that, that it can really just add body, you know, just huge amounts of body and fullness to your production. You just want to bring it up really lightly to where it's not really perceivable and you can't really hear it, but it just adds this body to whatever you're doing, so it doesn't sound so dry. Does that make sense? Because I've heard so many times that people could have done that in their production and just didn't try to fill out the spectrum like that, you know, and it just sounded flat. It sounded like, well, there was just like, you need to hire a keyboardist or a pad synth guy or something, bro. You know, I mean, because it just doesn't, you know, you've got so much, I mean, it just doesn't sound nowhere near as good as it could. Just be real careful with it. Sometimes you can bring it up a little louder to where it's perceivable, and sometimes you just got to keep it real light so you can't hardly even perceive it's there. But it just adds fullness to the spectrum, so the production sounds so much fuller and fatter. And sometimes just in sections, it might be fine through the verse, but in the chorus that you got this hook going on, that you could be adding this sub level thing or some octave work to whatever the guitar or the keyboard's doing it, with some synth patch that complements it real well, that doesn't fight with it to make it sound funny, but really lightly underneath it to where you can't even hear it, that just adds this fullness sound to whatever's going on, that all of a sudden that chorus section just sounds like, wow, yeah, dude, that sounds nice and full and thick and rich and lush, and yeah, dude, off we go. You know, it's a huge concept, filling in the frequency field and to experiment with it. You know, like I've told you before, get some practice tracks that are just, you know, vocalist, you know, maybe some harmonies, you know, guitar and bass and drum, you know, and try doing some of that stuff. You know, put in a pad synth somewhere that's really quiet, you can't hardly hear it, you know, in the low end and the mid end and the high end and the real high end, and just listen to it. Watch it just fill out the frequency spectrum, but you can't even hardly hear it's even there. But it adds this huge amount of body to maybe that verse or that chorus or that transition before it went into the chorus or that bridge or something like that, that just has huge amounts of impact to make the production sound so much more professional and so much better. So I hope you enjoyed this video, and I certainly hope you enjoyed this short series on mixing concepts, that we addressed a bunch of the basic things, and we will get into some actual mixing in the next video or two. Peace, hope, love. Hope you enjoyed the video, and I'll see you in the next one.